Hello, I'm Franciscan Father Albert Haase. How do you keep faith when you're going through a difficult time? How do you manage to hang on to your faith during storms, during emotional hurricanes in your life? I've oftentimes found great consolation and great advice in chapter 14 of Matthew's Gospel. It's in chapter 14 of Matthew's Gospel that we have that wonderful story of Jesus walking on the water. And I think that story really, for me, conveys some important parts. First of all, in that story, Jesus tells the disciples to get into a boat and to precede him to the other side of the lake. And so, being obedient disciples, they do exactly what the Master asks of them. They get in a boat, they go into the other side of the lake, and where does that get them? In the midst of a storm, in the middle of the sea, which clearly terrifies them. Here's point number one. Just because I'm doing the will of God does not insulate me, does not protect me from the storms and the hurricanes of life. The fact is, bad things sometimes do happen to good people. Just because I'm doing God's will does not protect me from difficult times. In the very midst of that storm, Jesus comes towards the disciples walking on water, but they don't recognize him. And that's the second point in terms of keeping faith in the midst of difficult times. We've got to believe that even though we don't always recognize Jesus, Jesus is always with us in the midst of the storm. Jesus is always with us in the hurricanes of our lives. We don't always recognize him, but he comes to us in friends, in relatives, in people who come offer us consolation, who help us to get back on our feet. Jesus is always with us in the midst of the storm, though we don't always recognize him. And then, in the midst of the storm, Jesus asks Peter to step out of the boat and to walk on water. And Peter does. But as soon as Peter begins to realize how strong the winds are, he takes his focus off of Jesus and he begins to look at his feet. And it's then when he begins to sink. Point number 3 in terms of keeping faith in difficult times, point number 3 is this. When you are challenged to move beyond your comfort zone, when you're called to have to let go of your security blanket, when you're called out of the boat, keep your eyes fixed on Jesus and don't look at your feet. Don't make the mistake that Peter made, thinking that somehow or another you have to do this on your own. We walk by faith and not by sight. And that's tested in the very midst of these difficult periods, these emotional hurricanes in our lives. We have to keep our eyes fixed on Jesus. And should it happen that we make the mistake that Peter made, and we begin to look at our feet, and we begin to sink, point number 4, just as he did with Peter, Jesus reaches out, he grabs us, and he says, "Don't be afraid. Have faith." And he reaches up, he picks us up, and he brings us to dry land. You have to always believe that when Jesus brings you to dry land, that's where you belong. And so, in order to keep faith in the midst of the emotional hurricanes of life, remember, just because you're doing the will of God does not insulate you from the storms and the hurricanes of life. Number 2, remember, in the midst of the storm, even though you don't recognize him, Jesus is always there. Jesus comes to us in the midst of our trials in life. Number 3, when like Peter you're called out of the boat, you're called beyond your comfort zone, keep your eyes fixed on Jesus and don't look at your feet. Just hang tough. We walk by faith, not by sight. And remember, should you end up giving up and feeling like God has abandoned you, remember, Jesus will pick you up and bring you to dry land. And with great, great consolation, he'll always say to us, don't be afraid. Have faith. I am always with you. The Lord give you his peace. Thank you very much.